In a distant time, in a land called Uz, there lived a man named Job. He was known far and wide for his unwavering integrity and deep devotion to God. Job wasn't just another wealthy man. He was a shining example of what it meant to live a life of righteousness. He feared God and shunned evil in every form, walking a path that many respected and admired. Job's life was truly blessed. He had a large, loving family, 7 sons and 3 daughters, who often gathered to feast and celebrate together, strengthening their bonds. Job's home was filled with laughter, warmth, and a sense of unity that made it a place of joy and contentment. It was a home where love thrived and where the lessons of faith were passed down through the generations. But Job's blessings went beyond his family. He was a man of immense wealth, with possessions that stretched across the fields of Uz. He owned thousands of sheep, camels, oxen, and donkeys, and his lands were worked by many loyal servants. His wealth and influence spread throughout the region, making him one of the greatest men in the East. Yet, it wasn't the riches that defined Job's life. Each day, Job turned his heart to God. After every family gathering, he would rise early and offer sacrifices on behalf of each of his children, saying, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." He sought to maintain purity not only in his own life but in the lives of those he loved. Job's devotion wasn't an act. It was woven into every part of his being. He knew that all he had, his family, his wealth, his standing, came from God, and he cherished those gifts with a humble heart. Job's life seemed like the very picture of how faithfulness to God brought prosperity and joy. But beneath the surface, unseen forces were stirring, preparing to test the very foundations of Job's faith. For now, though, in the land of Uz, Job's days flowed with a quiet, peaceful rhythm, as he lived in harmony with God and the blessings that filled his life. Unbeknownst to him, a shadow was gathering, ready to put his faith to the ultimate test. But beyond the world Job knew, a conversation took place in the heavenly realms, one that would change everything. The heavenly beings gathered before God, and among them was Satan, the accuser. God, with pride in his voice, asked, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Satan, ever cynical, replied with a challenge. "Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge of protection around him and his household and everything he has? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his wealth fills the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." Satan's words rang with doubt, suggesting that Job's faith was only skin deep, built on the comfort of his blessings. God, knowing the depth of Job's heart, accepted the challenge. "Very well, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." With this, the stage was set for a trial beyond anything Job could imagine. Satan now had the freedom to strip away all that made Job's life full. And so, while Job went about his days, unaware of the wager that had been made, dark clouds gathered on the horizon of his life. Soon, everything he held dear, his wealth, his family, would be tested, as his faith became the battleground between the forces of good and evil. And so, with God's permission, Satan set his plans into motion. The tranquility of Job's life was shattered in a single dreadful day, when a series of messengers arrived at his door, each bringing news more devastating than the last. The first burst into Job's home, breathless and terrified, his voice trembling as he spoke. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby when the Sabaeans attacked. They took everything and killed the servants with the sword. "I am the only one who escaped to tell you." Before Job could even process this loss, another servant arrived, his face pale with horror. Fire from the sky, God's own fire, it fell and burned up the sheep and the shepherds. "They are all gone. I am the only one who survived to bring you this news." As the words left the second servant's mouth, a third came rushing in, barely able to speak through his panic. The Chaldeans, they formed 3 raiding parties. They swept away all your camels and killed your servants with the sword. "I alone have escaped to tell you," Each message struck Job like a blow, but nothing could prepare him for what came next. The final messenger staggered in, tears streaming down his face, his voice broken with grief. "Your sons and daughters." They were feasting in the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a great wind came from the desert. It struck the four corners of the house, and it collapsed on them. "They are all dead. I am the only one who survived." The weight of the words crashed over Job, leaving him standing amidst the ruins of everything he once cherished. His wealth, his livelihood, and his children, all lost in a series of merciless blows. He fell to the ground, tearing his robe and shaving his head, symbols of his deepest mourning. Yet, even in this moment of overwhelming grief, Job's response was one of humility and submission to the will of God. "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart," he cried out. "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Job's heart was shattered, his soul crushed by sorrow, but he refused to curse God. Even as the darkness closed in around him, he clung to the flickering light of his faith, unwilling to let go. And in all this, despite the pain and confusion, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. The trials had only begun, but Job's resolve remained, holding firm against the oncoming storm. But the trials were far from over. Satan returned to the presence of God, unsatisfied with the results. He believed Job's faith could still be broken. "Skin for skin," he declared. "A man will give all he has for his own life. But stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." God, confident in Job's integrity, allowed this next wave of suffering. "Very well, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." So Satan went out and struck Job with painful sores, covering him from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. His body, once strong and healthy, became racked with torment. The boils were so severe that Job took a piece of broken pottery and used it to scrape himself as he sat among the ashes, seeking even a moment's relief from the constant, gnawing pain. Job's suffering was no longer just emotional but physical, a relentless agony that consumed him. And as he sat in the dust, broken and unrecognizable, his wife came to him, her own spirit crushed by the sight of his misery. She looked at the man she had known, now a shadow of himself, and could not hold back her despair. "Are you still maintaining your integrity?" she asked, bitterness and sorrow thick in her voice. "Curse God and die." Her words stung, not because of their harshness, but because they spoke to a temptation lurking deep within Job's own heart. A temptation to give up, to surrender to the darkness that had consumed his life. But even in his shattered state, Job refused. His voice, weak and strained, held a spark of determination. "You are talking like a foolish woman," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. "Shall we accept good from God, and not trouble?" Though his body ached and his heart was heavy with grief, Job clung to his faith. He did not understand why he suffered, nor could he see any end to his pain. But he held on to the belief that God's will, even when shrouded in mystery, remained sovereign. In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Even as his life crumbled around him, even as he faced the growing shadows of doubt and despair, he refused to curse the one he had always served. But the silence from heaven was deafening, and Job's spirit sank deeper into the darkness, wondering how much more he could endure. Yet somewhere within that darkness, the faint hope still lingered, the belief that perhaps, one day, he might find an answer. As Job sat among the ashes, 3 of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, heard of his suffering and decided to come to comfort him. They traveled from their distant homes, and when they saw Job from afar, they could barely recognize him. His once proud and strong figure had become gaunt and disfigured by pain. Grief overwhelmed them, and they wept aloud, tearing their robes and sprinkling dust on their heads as signs of mourning. For 7 days and 7 nights, they sat with him in silence, sharing his sorrow without uttering a word, for they saw that his suffering was too great. But after those long, silent days, their desire to comfort turned into a search for answers, and the silence broke. Eliphaz, the first to speak, tried to make sense of the tragedy. He suggested that no one suffers without reason, hinting that Job's suffering might be a consequence of some hidden sin. "Think now," he said gently, "who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed?" It was a hard blow, disguised as concern, and Job's heart sank. He knew that he had not turned away from God, that he had walked blamelessly. Yet, here were his friends, implying that he must have done something to deserve his misery. Then Bildad and Zophar joined in, each offering their own harsh interpretation. Bildad spoke of God's justice, implying that Job's children might have perished because of their own wrongdoing. Zophar, less restrained, insisted that Job's suffering was proof that he needed to repent. "If you put away the sin in your hand and allow no evil to dwell in your tent, then you will lift up your face without shame." Job listened, his soul heavy with frustration and hurt. These were his friends, men he had trusted, and yet they spoke as though his suffering was his own doing, as though he had brought this torment upon himself. Their words were like salt in his wounds, turning the comfort he had hoped for into a painful debate. In response, Job defended his integrity with all the strength he had left. "How long will you torment me and crush me with your words?" he cried out. "I have heard many things like these. Miserable comforters are you all." He maintained his innocence, insisting that his suffering could not be explained by any wrongdoing on his part. Job's spirit was torn between the accusations of his friends and the silence of God. He felt utterly alone, his cries to heaven unanswered, and the companionship of his friends turned into a trial of its own. Yet, even as their words cut deeply, Job refused to let go of his belief that there was more to his suffering than they could see. He clung to the hope that somewhere beyond the darkness, God would reveal the truth, that he would find the understanding he so desperately sought. And so, the debates raged on, his friends pressing their accusations, and Job holding fast to his innocence. But through it all, one question loomed in his heart. Why had God allowed this? Why had the one he trusted left him to suffer so alone? As the debates with his friends dragged on, Job's heart grew even heavier. Their words, instead of bringing comfort, only deepened his sense of isolation. Frustrated and anguished, he turned his cries directly to God, questioning the silence that seemed to stretch endlessly above him. Job poured out his bitterness, lamenting the day of his birth and wondering aloud why he had ever come into the world if his fate was to endure such relentless suffering. He questioned why the light of life was given to those who suffer and to those whose path is hidden. Why is life given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? He asked, his voice cracking with the weight of his sorrow. As he grappled with the agony that filled every corner of his life, Job sought to understand the reason behind his torment. He longed for a hearing before God, a chance to lay out his case and receive answers. If only I knew where to find him. If only I could go to his dwelling, he cried out. I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out what he would answer me. But all Job's cries seemed to vanish into the void, unanswered. He struggled to reconcile the God he had known, compassionate, just, and protective, with the silence that now met his pleas. Job began to question the very nature of justice and the fairness of the world he had believed in. He looked at the world around him and saw the wicked prospering while the innocent suffered, and it seemed to contradict everything he had believed about God's order. Despite his deep sense of injustice, there was still a flicker of hope, a longing for vindication that kept Job going. He spoke of a mediator, someone who could stand between him and God, bridging the gap between human pain and divine mystery. Even now, my witness is in heaven. My advocate is on high, he declared, clinging to the hope that there might be an understanding beyond his suffering, even if he couldn't see it. Job's mind wrestled with thoughts of life and death, of justice and suffering, of God's apparent silence. He lamented the unfairness of it all, but amidst his questions, he still held onto the belief that his cries were not entirely in vain. Somewhere, somehow, he felt that there was a purpose he could not grasp. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him, he whispered, his words a mix of defiance and desperate trust. And so, Job continued to search for answers in the darkness, torn between hope and despair, his voice rising up in the night. He yearned for understanding, for a glimpse of the reasons behind his pain, but all he found were questions echoing back to him. Yet through it all, he held on to the faint belief that perhaps, one day, God would speak, and the silence would finally be broken. As Job's struggle deepened, so too did his reflections on the nature of life and death. He sat amid the ashes, his mind filled with thoughts of mortality and the fleeting nature of human existence. Man born of woman is a few days and full of trouble, he murmured, his voice weary. He springs up like a flower and withers away. Like a fleeting shadow, he does not endure. Job's suffering led him to confront the inevitability of death, a release he almost yearned for in his pain. He imagined the grave as a place where the turmoil of life would finally cease, where the suffering of the flesh would be no more, and he could find rest from the relentless torment that had overtaken him. But even in his darkest thoughts, Job could not let go of a strange, almost defiant hope, a hope that stretched beyond death itself. In the midst of his laments, a new thought took hold of him, one that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than his despair. If someone dies, will they live again? He wondered, wrestling with the mystery of existence. Job began to speak of a desire for vindication that reached beyond the grave, a belief that somewhere beyond the pain, beyond the finality of death, there was a Redeemer who would stand up for him. With a voice that trembled with both uncertainty and conviction, he declared, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me." This hope, fragile yet unyielding, was like a flickering candle in the darkness of Job's suffering. He envisioned a future where, despite everything, he would stand before God, not as a broken man seeking answers, but as someone whose pain had been acknowledged, whose cries had been heard. It was a glimmer of light in a life otherwise consumed by shadows. Job's thoughts oscillated between the inevitability of death and the yearning for redemption. He was caught in a battle between despair and a profound, almost prophetic hope, one that spoke of a justice beyond his understanding. He couldn't see how or when, but he clung to the belief that, in the end, his suffering would be met with divine understanding, that his story would not end in ashes. And so, amid his questions and struggles, Job held onto this vision, this glimpse of a Redeemer. It was a vision that gave him the strength to continue, even as the pain of his reality threatened to overwhelm him. He didn't have the answers he sought, but he had the hope that one day they would come. For now, he waited, still longing for the day when the mysteries of his suffering would finally be revealed. As Job clung to the hope of a Redeemer, his thoughts continued to turn over the mysteries of life and death. He found himself grappling with the fragility of human existence, speaking of life as a breath, a fleeting vapor that vanishes as quickly as it appears. But amidst these reflections, a deeper question tormented him. Why had God remained silent in the face of his suffering? Why did the innocent seem to suffer while the wicked often lived in comfort? Job's mind churned with the injustices he saw, not just in his own life but in the world around him. He watched as those who seemed to disregard God thrived, while those who sought righteousness were often met with hardship. It felt like a bitter paradox, one that defied his understanding of divine justice. Why do the wicked live on, growing old and increasing in power? He asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Their homes are safe and free from fear. The rod of God is not upon them. Yet, even as he struggled with these questions, Job's longing for connection with God remained unshaken. He wished for an audience with God, for a moment where he could present his case and seek answers directly. But more than that, Job sought an advocate, someone who could bridge the distance between his frail human perspective and the unknowable vastness of God's will. He pictured a mediator who would stand with him in the heavenly courts, pleading on his behalf, offering words when he himself felt too broken to speak. "Even now my witness is in heaven. "My advocate is on high," he said, clinging to this vision of a bridge between the finite and the infinite. It was as if Job sensed that somewhere beyond his suffering, a truth existed that could make sense of his pain. In the depths of his despair, Job's thoughts turned again to the grave, imagining it as a place where his suffering might find an end, where he could rest from the endless questions that haunted him. Yet, alongside these dark thoughts, his yearning for understanding burned like a flame that would not go out. He believed that beyond the silence, beyond the shadow of death, there was a God who saw him, a God who would one day reveal the answers hidden in the folds of his suffering. Job's lament became a search for meaning, a journey through the darkest valleys of human experience, guided by a hope that defied the evidence of his shattered life. His pain was real, his questions profound, but the hope of seeing God face to face, even if it came after all earthly answers had failed, sustained him. So, he continued to wait, wrestling with his doubts, longing for the day when God's voice would break through the silence. Job's cries rose up like a storm, filled with the raw honesty of a man searching for light in a world that had grown dark. He knew that he might never understand why he suffered, but he held on to the hope that somehow, somewhere, a greater purpose lay beyond the pain. And with that hope, Job endured, clinging to the belief that in the end, he would see the face of his Redeemer. And then, when the silence seemed most unbearable, God finally spoke. Out of the whirlwind, his voice came like thunder, breaking through the stillness that had surrounded Job for so long. It wasn't the answer Job had been expecting. No explanation for his suffering, no reasons given for his pain. Instead, God began to question Job, his words sweeping through the air like the winds of a storm. "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge?" God's voice rang out. "Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." Job, who had longed so deeply for this moment, found himself standing before a presence that filled the world, a power that stretched beyond human understanding. God asked him about the foundations of the earth, the depths of the sea, the expanse of the heavens. "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand." God's questions pulled Job's mind away from the narrow focus of his own suffering, revealing a universe filled with mysteries far beyond human comprehension. He spoke of the paths of the stars, the depths of the oceans, and the wild creatures that roamed the earth. "Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Can you loosen Orion's belt? Do you give the horse its strength or clothe its neck with a flowing mane?" Each question was like a wave crashing against Job's understanding, showing him a world vast and complex, where every creature and force had its place in a divine order. Job began to see that his struggles, though real and painful, were part of a tapestry far larger than he could grasp. The God he had thought silent was, in truth, the same God who governed the movements of the cosmos, who watched over the birth of mountain goats and set the boundaries of the seas. Humbled and overwhelmed, Job realized the limits of his own perspective. The questions he had wrestled with, the accusations he had made in his despair, they all paled in comparison to the scope of God's creation and wisdom. Job had demanded answers, but in God's presence, he found a deeper understanding, that some mysteries lay beyond human reach, and that God's ways were higher than he could fathom. Job's voice trembled as he finally replied to the Almighty. "I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more." But God wasn't finished yet. He continued to speak, reminding Job that true wisdom comes from recognizing the limits of human understanding. He described the power of Leviathan, the might of Behemoth, creatures that symbolized the untamable forces of creation. Job saw in these words a reflection of his own struggles, the storms of life that no man could hope to control. In the end, God's response wasn't about explaining the why of Job's suffering, but about revealing the who, the nature of the God who holds all things in his hands. It was a reminder that, even when life seems chaotic and cruel, it remains under the care of a creator whose wisdom surpasses human knowledge. In the face of this revelation, Job's heart softened. He no longer demanded answers, but instead, He bowed before the mystery of a God whose ways were beyond his own. He found a peace, not in understanding the reasons behind his pain, but in recognizing that God was with him in it, present in both the whirlwind and the silence. Humbled and deeply moved by God's words, Job replied once more, but this time his tone was different, gentler, full of awe. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job acknowledged the limits of his understanding, bowing before the greatness of God, the mystery that stretched far beyond human suffering and sorrow. And then, in this moment of surrender, something changed. God turned his attention from the whirlwind and spoke directly of Job's friends. He rebuked Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar for speaking wrongly about him, unlike Job, who had wrestled with his doubts yet sought the truth. God instructed them to offer a sacrifice, and he told Job to pray on their behalf, so that their error might be forgiven. Job, the man who had once sat alone in ashes, covered in sores, now became a mediator for his friends, praying for their forgiveness. It was an act of grace, a sign that even in the deepest wounds, there could be healing, and in the darkest trials, there could be reconciliation. And then, in his boundless mercy, God restored Job's fortunes. But it wasn't just a return to what he had before. God blessed Job with twice as much as he had lost. His flocks and herds multiplied, and his wealth grew even greater than it had been in those days before tragedy struck. His home, once filled with silence and mourning, echoed again with the sounds of life. God gave Job more children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, just as before. But these new daughters, the text tells us, were the most beautiful in all the land. And Job, who had once feared he would never find joy again, lived to see his children's children, even to the 4th generation. He watched as life continued, as laughter filled his home once more, and as the land of Uz became a place of blessing again. But the restoration was not just about wealth and family. Job himself had been transformed. He now carried a deeper understanding of the world, a greater humility, and a renewed reverence for the God who had walked with him through the valley of suffering. He no longer saw himself as a man with all the answers, but as one who had glimpsed the vastness of God's creation and accepted that some mysteries would always remain beyond his grasp. In the end, Job died, old and full of years, having lived a life that had been tested by fire and refined through suffering. And though the scars of his trials remained, they were tempered by the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, he had never truly been alone. Through the silence, through the storm, and through the healing that followed, God had been with him. The story of Job, then, is not just one of loss and restoration, but of a faith that holds fast through every trial, of a soul that finds its way back to hope even when all seems lost. And in the quiet of his final days, as Job looked back on the path he had traveled, he understood that through it all, God's presence had never wavered, guiding him from despair to a peace that passed all understanding.